So, Fauxlosophers.
Fauxlosophers.
So, this will be the third entry in our series about Christianity, 3 out of 4. And this week we're talking about personal experiences and morality.
In that order?
In that order. So, these seem to be some of the biggest reasons I hear why people will really hold on to, well, Christianity or really any religion. Or especially one that centers around a deity, one deity. Morality in particular, where there is a panic about how can we make moral decisions if there is not an arbiter of morality who tells us what's right and wrong objectively.
Right.
And also...
Yeah, sorry, you go ahead.
And also personal experiences basically across any religion or religion-like thing in which people are believing in supernatural phenomena. They will have certain experiences which they think totally confirm their belief.
Sure.
Did you have something to add?
Well, I was just going to say, we do cover parts of morality in our Roots of Morality video.
Mm-hmm.
I'd highly recommend watching that one if you want maybe a non-Christianity specific view on it. But that was all I was just going to kind of harken back to that because I do feel like we are going to go on at some length about morality today, but I would estimate that it's going to be much more tuned to the situation.
Correct.
Since we're actually offering formal arguments, we're not just armchairing about something and discussing it.
Right. So let's first talk about personal experiences. So last week we talked about revelation, and personal experiences are basically like revelation, except that they are not quite as specific usually as revelation, or they don't contain the same type of information as revelation. Revelation normally is, a command from God or something like that, or a message that needs to be told to God's people.
Literally something he's revealed
right
to you. Why it's called revelation.
Whereas a personal experience could be a revelation, or it might be something you experienced while having a near-death experience, or
you wake up abruptly, and it might even be a very, much more so than normal, vivid dream, even, I've heard.
Visions.
Yes.
Yep. That kind of thing.
Even down to just feelings that you get, or seeing something in something else. Like, they're joked about now, but seeing Jesus in a piece of toast.
I knew you were going to bring up the toast.
But still, to some, that is absolutely considered a revelation, and it has some significance that is yet to be determined. So
right.
But it's significant.
Right. Well, in some way. So basically, the problem with personal experiences primarily are the same problems that there are with revelation. Because revelation really is just a subset of personal experiences.
Right.
We failed to mention this last week, but
we're here now. We can fix it.
For those who don't remember or didn't see it, the problem with revelation, and by extension personal experiences, is that they're basically just hearsay to everyone else.
Right.
That even if you really had, like, we don't necessarily doubt you had such an experience, but we doubt the conclusion that you've arrived at based on your experience.
Right. And this is, the concept is more general, but in Christian it's going to being applied to directly Christian revelations, but the phenomena that's occurring can be incurred by anything and could occur about anything. And that's the problem with it as well, and ultimately, you can't ever really know exactly what someone else experienced either. And so anything someone tells you that you cannot then go do yourself or replicate yourself has to be taken with some grain of salt. Now, don't get me wrong, you have to give some trust to people
Right.
in
So
general.
that's something I wanted to say, is that the claims about these personal experiences are normally made in honesty. People who talk about their personal experiences normally are not trying to deceive people.
Sure.
They're trying to give an honest account of what it is they saw. The problem is that the thing that you saw might not be what you think it was.
Right.
And so another problem with this is that normally personal experiences are talked about in a context of a very personal relationship.
Right.
Very few people will just stand on a soapbox and talk about how they almost died in the hospital and saw Jesus or something. It's more likely to be in a personal conversation, perhaps with a non-believer, in which they'll say, I know Jesus is real and he's the Son of God. I saw him in a vision or something like that. And it's this appeal to emotion, don't you trust me? Don't you trust what I have to say?
No, not inherently.
Right.
But still, I get what you're saying.
Trying to pull on the heartstrings of the person rather than making a real argument.
And exactly. And I'd like to take a brief tangent to say that's why I think you see oftentimes religion spread. There are other reasons for this, but it spreads very strongly amongst family members. And when I say that, I mean family members that maybe aren't people that you live with, like in your direct family. Like for instance, we've already discussed parents indoctrinating their children because that's the best that parents know how to do, or that's just the default setting for what we do. If I believe it, it's good enough for my kids to believe it. So it doesn't matter what the belief is. But say like someone who doesn't live with you, like a cousin or a grandparent or something like that, it will often be. I think that's a vein in which it's used because it's someone that you do generally trust. Higher so than a stranger. This is an entirely different discussion, but I believe that there's a baseline of trust that is afforded to every stranger. Because it's not zero, because there are people that you would trust less than a stranger, someone that for a fact is deceitful or dishonest.
Right. Has a bad reputation.
Things like that. So they're on the, that's all the way down to your zero is I wouldn't trust them as far as I could throw them. But, and then you have up from there's the normalized point of like, well, this is just your average stranger, and you'd have to weigh, well, I don't know them, and your biases play into effect. And then there's the people that you tend to know better, your friends and your family members. And I think it's pulling at the fact that they are inadvertently maybe even using the trust they have earned in other areas to try to then cash it out for this as well. Which this can happen all the time anyway for non-Christian related things, but in Christianity, there's a strong push evangelistically to go out and be friends with people, not too many people, but be friends with people who don't agree with you, and through developing that relationship, you can bring them to Christ, is what they'll say. And what that really means is go out there and earn their trust so that they'll believe you when you say these things and get them to think about it. And it's not ever sold, well, I can't say ever, but I doubt it's mostly sold like that. Like, I don't think there's the dark underground Christian tacticians who are like, all right, we got to get these people to get friends and infiltrate them. It's not clandestine like that. But
right. Not normally anyway.
Not normally, but it's practically the same. You gain a person's trust, and then you use the trust that you've earned to then apply to something else that you can't prove, and you go from there. So
right. So another thing, citing a personal experience as an argument to believe in Christianity really is just a specific argument from ignorance. That's really what it is.
Right.
That basically you're saying, I saw this. I have no other explanation except that Jesus is the Son of God.
Sure.
Or that it was specifically Jesus that I saw in my vision, or whatever the experience might have been, or I almost died and I saw heaven. And it inherits the other problems of arguments from ignorance, that it creates a false dichotomy, really, because it excludes other conclusions that you could just as easily insert through ignorance, such as name any other religion. Now, if you had a vision of Jesus, it's probably not a sign of the truth of Islam. But if you think you saw some heavenly paradise, or a demon or something like that, then these exist across religious cultures.
Right.
But then, even more importantly, people from different cultures have different such religious personal experiences that directly conflict with those had by Christians. They might have a vision of Muhammad, for instance, or some Hindu goddess or something. So if we take personal experiences directly at their word and believe them, we reach contradictions. These beliefs can't coexist. They reach conflicting conclusions.
Right. And not only that, but I don't know if you're going to bring it up, but there's this human proclivity towards self-fulfilling prophecies, and I know that's not exactly, what we're talking about in the most technical sense, but if you are already a member of, say, a church or a religion, and or you've just been exposed to only that doctrine, right? Or mostly only that doctrine, as tends to happen a lot. Most of the time, when you're being raised around religion, you're not generally exposed to other religions very often, and I mean that in the practice sense.
That's correct.
Like, for example, in the United States, religion has permeated the culture to such a point that you can make religiously sourced comments that non-religious people will still understand,
Right.
Like if someone sells you out and you say, "Thank you, Judas, how's the 30 pieces?" We all know most people will know what that means to some degree of that saying. They all know the basic story, even if they don't believe in it. Whereas, and this is where my own ignorance is showing, because I don't know another one, but if there is some trait about Vishnu that I didn't know about, that one of the Hindu, in the Hindu canon, I don't know anything about that. God.
I think Vishnu is a goddess. Yeah.
Yeah, whichever. But I'm sure that it's personified in some way that has a trait that you could make a pun about, or you could make a relatable saying about. That I would
or just a legend or something like that.
Sure.
It can be any story to do something like that from. So
yeah, any story. But even just that bit of permeation, when you experience something that you don't understand, you immediately begin attempting to rationalize it inadvertently. You can't help it. Your brain cannot deal with things that
don't make sense.
It has to figure out why. And its inclination is going to be to solve the problem as quickly as possible. So it's going to jump to the first conclusion that it can whip together with what it has in your memory and experiences to do that. So if you see something like a dark shadow with two red orbs of glowing light in it, and that's your brief image, and you are afraid, because who wouldn't be, in that case, if you didn't know what it was, and you know what a demon is, or if you've heard of a demon, you will begin ascribing qualities to it if that's something you're readily exposed to, and vice versa. And not only that, but you see a lot of times what will happen is you can take a person, expose them to something that's very obscure to them, that they don't know what it is, very briefly. There's plenty of people who've done studies on imprinting thoughts onto people subconsciously, subliminal messaging in a way. And one of them, what was really interesting, is they hired some, sorry to continue down the rabbit hole here, but I think this is a very interesting experiment they did. They took this company, this research group, fronted as a big corporation that was trying to hire on or advertising agents to pitch to them, right? So what they did is they had all these advertising agents take the same route through town, where they had all kinds of imagery just hidden in plain sight, already built into certain billboards or shapes and things like that. And using only a few key words, they were able to get these advertising agents to come up with slogans and logos that were already predetermined by the research team. They had already laid things out, and to a surprising degree of confidence. And so the same principle applies here. Even if I don't believe in what a demon is, but I know about the lore of what a demon is or angel, and I see something that only barely marks it, but it's so far away from anything else I could readily grab to. And if it's a demon or an angel, I don't have to go any further. I don't have to continue to rationalize. It's like, oh, that's already something. It's a mystical being, check, and it is of this variety, check. I know what it is now. Even if I don't know what it really means, at least I have an answer. Your brain wants an answer. That's what it wants most. And so, same principle, but applied here. And I think that's responsible for a majority of these stories you hear about, oh, this non-believer died, and then they were revived 4 minutes later, and then they write this account about what heaven was like. Or they believe that they saw an angel or something like that. Well, it's like, well, they already knew what that was. What would truly be amazing if someone had no clue what it was and could describe it in any actual detail. Which, every time I've ever heard of that being attempted to be shown, it's tainted because it's not performed scientifically. It's all hearsay, or there's leading the witness. That's not what it's called in this case, but people are being led to a conclusion by being fed descriptions that are then reiterated back and then acted like they originated with the person. So I think that's a big culprit.
So one of my favorite things to do to break down a broken argument is to put it in syllogistic form. Because normally putting things in very explicit syllogistic forms exposes weaknesses in arguments. So the syllogism for the argument from personal experience is, premise 1, my interpretations of my personal experiences are infallible. Premise 2, I had a personal experience in which I saw heaven. Premise 3, therefore heaven exists. Now, the arrogance in premise 1 should be palpable upon consideration. And I'd like to say again, this is not an accusation that those who give arguments from personal experiences are arrogant people, but rather that the argument is still based on an attitude of arrogance, whether it's intentional or not.
Right. There's a certain amount of hubris that is, that's unknown. It's just like when people use the phrase white man's burden or the modern equivalent. Like, you can be inadvertently arrogant and even offensive to those by trying to be kind and say, like, oh, well, I can't expect you to know better.
Right.
And while they're trying to maybe help you with an excuse, what you're actually doing is insulting that person's status. But, the intention matters to a degree, but when you put it in that framework and take it just a statement at a time, it's easy to lose the arrogance when it's all piped together. But when you separate it out,
right,
you can really notice it.
Right. So that's what I had to say about personal experiences. That they're really just a superset of revelation, which we've already talked about. That they are appeals to emotion, arguments from ignorance, at best, and arrogant at worst. So let's talk about morality. This should be more interesting. So, like Joe already mentioned, we already talked about morality before in our Roots of Morality episode. So what we're really talking about here is the argument from morality as it relates to Christianity. And so we'll start again with the syllogism, because I think we need to all be on the same page here. What does the argument from morality mean?
Also, can I interject real quick?
Yes.
Do you have a rough definition of what that means?
What?
The term?
What term? Syllogism?
Yeah.
Oh, so a rough definition, a syllogism is just a piece-by-piece argument.
Okay.
Um,
I just wanted to bring it up because I didn't know how to spell it, which meant I probably couldn't give an accurate definition later.
I see.
And I want it to be said. Just trying to be thorough.
Yeah. So where you take the argument, first you state the premises of the argument all up front, and then from the premises state the conclusions. And if one of the conclusions is a premise for a further conclusion, then you put those in order like you're supposed to.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
So the syllogism for the argument for morality is absolute moral rights and wrongs can only exist if there is a God. Premise 2, absolute moral rights and wrongs do exist, therefore God exists, or a God exists.
Well, I can tell you right now, there's just two very big problems with that one.
Well, yes.
Because what you're doing is you're essentially asserting two. Well, the first assertion is relating two things immediately, neither of which. Well, wait, okay. I take issue with these types of. I'm going to mispronounce the words. I'm not going to say it. You pronounce it?
Syllogism?
Syllogism. Okay. I've been butchering words lately. I'm trying to get better at it. So, these types of syllogisms really kind of get on my nerves. Is when you falsely conflate two things, morality and God, then state a claim that one of the two things exists, which is something that obviously most people would agree with, and then essentially let the other ride the coattails. Like in this example, the main issue is the first line is, absolute moral rights and wrongs can only exist if God exists, right? And then you say absolute morals, rights, and wrongs do exist, or objective morality exists. Well, most people would have agreed with the second premise, or even if you didn't, whatever.
Right, but most people would.
Most people...
Which is, this argument is meant to sway most people.
Right, and then once you say that, then you can just infer the other thing exists, And I hate it when that happens. It's borderline. It's borderlining almost on a false equivocation fallacy, really. And you hear this one so often. This is in this format. It's object A exists only if object B exists. Object A exists, therefore object B exists. In its most simplest form. You hear this all the time, and it's so easy to miss if you're just hearing someone say it, not in that line-by-line structure, that, I don't know, it's a pet peeve of mine that it exists and that people use it so often to try to just pull the wool over the eyes of others.
Well, so an argument of this of the syllogistic form you gave, which is A cannot exist without B, or rather, if B exists, then A. B exists, therefore A. There's nothing wrong with that.
Right. My issue is it depends. It depends on what A and B is, which that's what we're getting to
exactly.
In this case.
So, well, the place where I was going to go is that it's begging the question.
Right.
So
I didn't want to steal
that's the problem, is that we're sort of begging the question, because the conclusion is God exists.
Right.
And so the question begging is carefully hidden in premise 1. Let's split up premise 1 real quick. So premise 1 was objective moral right and wrongs cannot exist unless God exists. So we're basically saying something which exists can't exist without the conclusion.
Right.
Basically.
Yes.
So it's
you could simplify this argument as saying simply, if God doesn't exist, objective morality doesn't exist. That's the further simplified way to put this argument. And that's a lot harder to defend argument than if you lay it out and bait it in the way you do. And I think there's something to be said about, I'll call them adversarial debates, because oftentimes it's difficult to find. Never mind. I'm not going to try to cast aspersions on apologists because I'm not trying to perform an ad hominem here. But I'll just say this about adversarial debates, because there are people who tend to engage in adversarial debates about this topic. And it's mostly because we'll go back to the first episode where we talked about your identity, how religions tend to form as an identity around the believers of that religion. So when your identity gets involved, people get defensive and it becomes adversarial really quickly unless you ease into it, like we've said before. But when it becomes adversarial, it turns into a point scoring game in a way where we're trying to find common ground, maybe in the best case, or the worst case, you're looking for things that the other person will accept to then leverage into things they may not readily accept. Because in this case, it's, you say objective morality exists, right? Like, yeah. Well, I'd say it can't exist without God, so you really mean that God exists, right? And so by seeming like you're moving closer to the center, or you're changing blows, you're getting wins on the fact that you've gotten the other person to agree that objective morality exists, and you're in the same wheelhouse. Adversariously, that it's a point-scoring game, and this is a way where you will be given a point now and then fight for another one later. You know what I mean?
Right. So, well, yeah, and the thing that you just brought a little bit more light to is that basically, if you get someone to agree that objective morality exists, then it's a non sequitur to say, well, therefore God, because you're assuming that their definition of morality is, moral commands that come from God.
Right.
Because that's basically what you're defining morality to be. If you're saying objective morality can't exist without God, then objective morality means morality as dictated by God. Right. And that's also, so if you don't accept that definition, then it's a non sequitur. If you do accept the definition, then it's question begging.
Right.
Because you're saying moral orders given by God can't exist unless God exists. They do exist, therefore God exists. Question begging is obvious at this point.
Right, but it gives you the freedom to pivot to whichever one your opponent doesn't take.
Right.
So, which, again, I would not recommend adversarially debating against. I don't recommend, and nor do I actually particularly enjoy publicized adversarial debates like this. As much as it might be interesting sometimes to watch your favorite proponent of your belief system go up against someone against a different belief system, to watch the YouTube threads about so-and-so, the guy I like smacks down, destroys, obliterates other person that I don't agree with. It's essentially, it's like philosophically masturbating to philosophical porn is what it is. Like,
right.
It's not realistic. It's not what the point of all of this is, but you enjoy it.
Right. You get a little bit of enjoyment out of it, but nothing is really being done.
Right.
Usually.
And so I know that might be disappointing for some people, and don't be wrong, I've watched videos before about the person I like laying out points I agree with against someone else, but...
Well, I think there's a time and a place for something like that, let's say that somebody is exploring different viewpoints. Then hearing what is considered to be a very good argument from somebody from a different perspective is a good thing to be exposed to. Mm-hmm. The problem is when you start listening to arguments like that when you already agree with them. Right. And you're just trying to reinforce your conclusions.
And feel good about being right.
Right.
Because, I'm right. I'm on that guy's side.
Right.
I'm forming a tribal relationship to reinforce my own insecurities.
Mm-hmm.
Woo! Sorry if I'm being harsh to somebody out there that maybe has very strongly disagreements against me, but I've been all down that road all to myself, and it's rough,
Well, it's easy to get into.
Definitely. And but we're not trying to be that right now, and that's not what I'm talking about. But it's hard sometimes to talk objectively about something when you can already hear the, antagonistic arguments coming out, or you've heard them many times before. It's hard not to break that. I mean, that's what this argument is. This argument gets dropped in those all the time. Stuff like this. I mean, I'm going to go ahead and drop a name. Was it William Lane Craig? Is that who he is?
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely, he drops these types of arguments all the time. And he even breaks them out syllogistically,
Uh-huh.
just like this. But and it can be frustrating if you disagree with this person, and it can be super overwhelmingly positive if you tend to agree with this person. But in an adversarial debate, it's not so much about it's got to be glamorous. There's show to it, and it's being able to punch it all out in a very charismatic way. And that's not...
It becomes a slogan more than an argument.
Boom, exactly. And that's where I take issue with it. Like, I would even take issue with somebody I agree with. I'm going to call it intentionally showboating their philosophy with, laying them down as just to be slapped on a t-shirt by some devotee later on, or a bumper sticker, or your flair on Reddit or whatever. That it's fine to agree with people, and it's fine to hear arguments being laid out, but when they're laid out like this for the purpose and intently on trying to score points in a debate, it loses sight of the whole point of anything that we're doing. And I agree with you, there is a time and a place for these big ticket debates, and it's when it's for the middle ground people. So it's for that's who can benefit the most, because it's exciting enough to make people realize that it's not just your high school debate team that you probably weren't on, since the majority of high school students don't join the debate team, and most of the people who aren't on it may have a slight negative tinge towards it, or are just completely agnostic to the whole thing, or apathetic. So it's nice for bringing people in to start the discussion, but it's like being super stoked that you nailed two pieces of wood together, so that all you do is nail two pieces of wood together because you're so good at it, but without actually moving forward to building anything carpentry based. You know what I mean? It's like playing level 1 on a video game that you can just stomp easily over and over again without moving to level 2. I'm going to say it like that. So I get it. I think anybody I think anybody who's really listening to this has probably been in there at some point. If you're not, well, welcome. But I think most of you have. It's kind of hard to avoid that nowadays, especially with the way the political climate's getting. Not to get too, circumstantial, but just keep in mind that we're trying to move forward with that. So anyone who would have any dissenting from this, or even just listening to this and just wholeheartedly agreeing all the time, well, if you agree or you disagree and you've reached a conclusion for this, well, you need to just keep moving and further developing it. So that's all I have to say. Sorry, I apologize for a little bit of the rant there, but it's just, I feel like it's too common right now, and something needs to be said. Not that my influence is going to be enough to make a real difference, probably, but
sure.
For my sake, I would not want to be lopped in with that group. I'm just saying, I'd hope for our sake anyway. So
I agree. So another thing I'd like to bring up about Christian morality is how inconsistent it is. Specifically, cherry picking of which commandments to follow.
Now, are you talking about cherry picking in, say, a believer's daily life or anything like that? Or are we talking more about, like, in the texts itself?
I mean in the text. So,
okay,
like believing that, let's say, homosexuality is wrong, but eating shrimp is fine, right? Now there's a whole lot of baggage with that.
Yeah.
And it depends a lot on which sect that you're a part of. But I think that Matthew 5 verse 18 is often overlooked, which is where Jesus says that not any part of the law is to be overturned until everything is finished. I think he said until the heavens and the earth die, or something like that. So
paraphrasing.
Right, so, yeah.
Hey, but you cited the source. I
did cite the source. Yes, you can read the verse in your preferred translation if you want.
Sure.
I think I like the phrasing in the King James, which is not one jot or tittle of the law will be overturned.
Jot and tittle. Why didn't we name this podcast Jot and Tittle?
Jot and tittle.
I could be Jot. Sorry, a little sidetrack.
So, but where we pick the things that we like, and we discard the things that we don't. Because a lot of Christians will say, "Oh, well, the stuff about shrimp and whatnot is all Old Testament. We can throw that away." Well, that's not what Jesus said. If you claim to really follow the Bible, you can't have that conclusion.
Right.
And there's the I think it might have been in Revelation, but I don't remember exactly where, when the person has the vision of the earth being covered and the animals being laid forth, all of the unkosher animals, and God saying to eat them. And the Christians take this as God granting permission to break the kosher laws.
Won't eat bacon.
Right, of course, because bacon is delicious. Now, of course, then sometimes it's also interpreted to mean you can share this religion with the Gentiles. It doesn't have to be for Jews.
Right.
And so there's a bunch of interpretation there. But the point is that then we either have something that's highly interpretive and needs to be taken in a very, very specific nuance for it to have consistent meaning, or we have a contradiction in the Bible again, where the Old Testament says you can't eat these things. Jesus says don't throw out the Old Testament, but Revelation, or whichever book this is from, says you're allowed to break these commandments.
Yeah.
So the point is that, first of all, most Christians haven't even read all the commandments. There's a lot of them.
Right. Well, and this again kind of goes back to what sect you belong to, or whatever you call it. There's so many that you can divvy yourselves up to however, but it depends on how legalistic your sect is, because and they range all the way from the orthodoxy, which is every rule that's there is meaningful and should be followed, to, well, it's all subjective and it's the spirit of the thing that's important. So find yourself on that spectrum and then apply this accordingly, I suppose.
Right. Right now, the thing that's always brought up is, we have the important commandments like the 10 Commandments, and of course, of the 10 Commandments, people normally only remember 2, which is don't kill and don't steal. And almost all the others are completely disregarded by most Christians. But
maybe don't lie. It's probably also remembered.
That's true. There's don't lie.
That gets complicated.
Right. But no one thinks about having idols or respecting the Sabbath or honoring your parents, things like that.
Or the most difficult one, which is putting no other gods or idols before the God of the Christian Bible. And actually, all those implications that come with that you hear about.
So here's a fun tangent. So in Judaism, the 10 Commandments are not actually all commandments. The first one is not a commandment, and they're called the 10 Statements.
Interesting.
Because the first commandment, the first statement is, "I am the Lord your God who delivered you from Egypt." And that's it. There is no first commandment.
Interesting.
And then the second is have no graven images. But because of Christian translations, it's been changed that the first one is have no other gods before me, which is also interesting, which implies the existence of other gods, but that's beside the point.
Right.
So I have a challenge for our listeners who happen to be believers. If you stopped believing in God, if you stopped being a Christian, would you really not feel bad about murdering people?
You can feel free to pause the video now to think about it, or recording.
Sure. Because that's really what's being said from the argument for morality, is that if you don't believe in a God, there's no reason not to murder people.
And I will go ahead and interject here, because there is a tangent that I do not want to go down, that we will get into at a later date, that I hear often about, well, of course I would still feel bad about it, because I come from the Judeo-Christian tradition, and the values have been passed down and instilled. So even if you don't believe in the God, you act out the will of the God you don't believe in by following the tradition anyway. If you know what I'm talking about and you've heard this similar argument before, don't worry. We'll get into that at some point. That's not what today's video is about.
No. So, but that's a serious challenge that if someone, cut you off in traffic or did something else to upset you, would you really not feel bad if you killed them in the street? Like, come on.
Right.
It's not just the belief holding you back. And if it is just the belief holding you back from murdering people in the streets, you should probably stop listening now and continue with your religion, because I think that says a lot about your character as a person.
I agree.
And you really shouldn't be trusted. And but we you haven't really done anything to warrant putting you in prison.
Right.
That if there's nothing holding you back from murdering, raping, and doing other heinous things, then your belief, genuinely, you are a dangerous person.
Right. Well, and I'm going to expand on that a little bit, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
The idea that you do not do, or you do certain things based on what God would tell you to do, or a holy book, or based on your religion, okay, implies that you are not responsible for yourself. It implies that you could not have helped it otherwise. And I hear some out there would nod in agreement. It's like, yes, that's why we're imperfect. We need God, because we would be like the other animals anyway. Well, to that point, I would keep in mind that there are those who've never heard of a God that don't behave this way. And you can say, oh, well, because God's still with them, or what, you can rationalize it however you'd like.
I think what a Christian would say is that God has written his law in your heart.
Okay.
Which is a totally different thing.
That's a totally different thing. But, well, there are two things to be said about that. You can actually look at other social species and see altruism at play. Humans do not have the monopoly on altruism. We barely hold the monopoly on theory of mind, which would allow us, which is where I would take the other road on, which we will get into later. Feel free to look it up if you, though. It's a really interesting concept.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't hold the monopoly on altruism. And it is said even by the scriptures itself, that, and I think all Christians would take to this, is that we were created in God's image, and that's often interpreted to mean that we are different than all other animals because we were endowed with the ability to do right and wrong. We were endowed with morality. I don't know that any other species is even referenced at all when it comes to morality. It's all about human beings. But we aren't the only species on the planet, and we're not the only ones that are social. We're also not the only ones that have altruistic tendencies. And you can try to rationalize them away all you want, but that's a fact. Altruism has been measured in other species, and some semblances of what we would consider to be moral exists for them as well. And to me, that's a glaringly weird thing to say that, well, we would be just like the animals otherwise. Well, other animals tend to have altruism. Granted, a very limited few, because there's the whole...
Well, non-mammals tend not to.
Non-mammals tend not to, but
some of them do.
It didn't say that, like a gorilla was created in the image of God, but gorillas can show altruism, or I think orangutans are the ones that were studied that show this, and chimpanzees, of course. But what does that say about that, And secondly, if you would be this way otherwise, then I think you really do sell humanity a lot shorter than it is. And I find it personally insulting for you to tell me that I would not behave the same way if I weren't exposed to the same tradition, or and you're robbing agency from people, and that's, I think we're kind of moving towards that anyway. what's tomorrow, or what's next week's about?
Next week is about coping with the unknown.
Okay, so I'm going to get into it in this week's episode anyway, since it seems we have adequate time to kill for now.
A little bit.
I don't know.
Still have a few more points.
Still have a few more points. Well, I'm going to get into it briefly now, and I'll expand on it at the end if we have time.
Okay.
Fair enough. You are not free as a person if you have been fixed to have morality, and you cannot act and behave morally without something else. You can't be responsible for yourself, and as David suggested, you probably should keep believing your religion because you need someone else to take care of you. And I'm sorry if I come across a little harshly. I'm not trying to, come through your headphones and attack you as an individual. That's not what I'm trying to do. But think about it like that. True liberty and freedom to chase and be happy, to chase your own desires as an individual are extremely limited. And what you're implying by saying that without God no morality exists is that no human being is free, and that we all should be subject to this individual, because that other individual or entity is the only thing that can be responsible for us. And I don't know about you or anything you know about rights and responsibilities, but you cannot have the right to something and you cannot be free to do something if you are not also responsible for the outcome. And that's my biggest thing about it, is when it all comes down to it, are you the individual responsible? And there are plenty of Christians out there who tell me that, well, yeah, you're still responsible because you have free will. Do I, though? If I can't choose my morality, if I can't adopt a different moral standard, and if I can't act in a way, and I had no choice but to be this way, it's essentially saying you have no other choice but to be, air quotes, free in that case.
Right.
So that's where I'm going to leave it, and we can expand a little more on that concept later on if we have time. But
right. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the problem of evil. You're familiar with the problem of evil?
I mean, in my own life, yeah.
The problem of evil as it is defined formally.
No.
Okay. So, basically, the problem of evil is an acknowledgement of the conflict between the idea of a moral God and the existence of evil.
Right. Okay, I have heard of this. I just didn't know that's what it was.
So I would prefer to quote Aristotle. I believe is who this quote is attributed to.
I mean, if not, it's not like you can prove it.
Right, sure.
It's so long ago.
Right, it's a very old quote. It's some Greek philosopher, but I think it was Aristotle.
Same thing.
Who said, if God is willing to stop evil, but not able, then he is impotent.
Or not God.
Right. If he is able, but not willing, he's evil. If he is both willing and able, then whence cometh evil? If he is neither willing nor able, then why call him God?
It's an interesting matrix you formed there.
Right. So basically it's that, if God really is all-powerful and omnibenevolent, why does evil exist? That if he has the ability to stop evil and also wants to stop evil, why hasn't he?
Right. Well, and I know the response to this. And
free will is the response.
Well, free will. Well, free will, and you often hear this brought up by people who, for instance, experience a tragedy. Like in religious circles, the sermon, I'll say, surrounding this topic often begins with, there was a insert person here who experienced great tragedy, and they asked the question, why God? Oh, why me? Why did this happen? Why does God allow evil to exist? And then, of course, there's an answer found in this religion, because what religion can't give answers to everything, And the answer is A, free will, or B, well, it's all part of the plan. God is actually in control of this evil, and it's, how else can you show that you have control if not to allow it to happen and then remediate it, So it's like, this evil has happened to you, but it was all a part of a plan. And to me, that just screams manipulation. But, we'll go down the free will side of things.
Sure. Well, the problem I have with free will in the context of Christianity is we are allegedly made in God's image.
Right.
God made every aspect of us, and we are imperfect, but by His design. So this basically means that God made us broken, and blames us for our wrongdoing, and allows us to do evil things so as to blame us for them.
All so that He can save us from them.
Right.
And that's the positive side. Well, supposedly the positive side of all this.
Right.
Right.
So this has to do with the existence of evil, but also I'd sort of like to transition into the concept of hell.
Before we do that, I would like to draw a quick metaphor from what was said. The context, the idea that God created something that is imperfect so that it would be imperfect, and by its imperfection incur His wrath, and then in order to save it from His own wrath, imply His own mercy to then save it, right? That's a very similar concept to me having a child, and because that's what it's like. Except, I'm imperfect, I'm not God. But to behave in that exact same fashion holds to an extremely, in my opinion, queer double standard, where take the exact same formula and remove the word God, and it's entirely immoral. And I don't think that anybody would agree with it.
Right. I'd like to make a slight complaint against your analogy to a child, because it's not like having a child. It's like constructing a robot.
Well, I could understand in constructing the robot.
Because you are in control of exactly how this creature will behave.
Fair enough.
As God.
Fair enough. I'll concede that that's being a better metaphor. Right. Okay.
So, you've programmed this robot to behave in a way that you totally understand, because God knows everything. God knows exactly what you'll do. So you've programmed this robot, but you will blame it for its mistakes. But it's really your fault.
We kind of already do this, though, with computer. Why did you do that, Microsoft Word? Why did you shift that whole paragraph down?
Right.
And then you smack your keyboard against the wall.
But normally we are not the authors of these programs on our computers, and so we'll blame them because we didn't make them. But If you wrote your own word processor and it misbehaved, it's your fault. You're just a bad programmer.
Yeah, but it's a lot easier to blame something else. Again, back to abdicating responsibility. But
sure.
So on. So hell.
So
that's a fun topic.
So hell, that based on this, if God made us in such a way that we would misbehave, and then blames us for what we've done based on His command. Not what He says to do at His command, but His command as to how we exist. How can He hold us up to such a standard that it warrants eternal punishment? First of all, we in our society basically all agree that punishments ought to be
measured
proportional to the offense. That's
right.
The word I was looking for. If you snatch a kid's candy bar, that's pretty mean. You might get slapped with a fine for that.
Or death penalty, depending on...
Sorry. Maybe. Probably not.
Only in North Korea.
Only in North Korea. Well, I said in our society, but...
True, my bad.
So we're not going to brutally torture people for stealing a candy bar from a child. Or at least we agree that that's probably not a measured response to do that. But what crime exists which is infinite in measure, such as to warrant infinite punishment?
Right. And I think you can this may not even just apply to hell, but heaven as well. Why would you take any infinite resolution out of the finite short lifespan. And you hear Christians talking about the times like we have this one very short life to do everything we got to do before the eternity. And it's like, why does that have to be eternity? You know, like, what about that? You know, and I've heard all sorts of theories like, oh, well, it's outside of time. And it's amazing to me how people talked about the differences between heaven and hell, even though they're supposed to be very similar as far as like the scales of them. They're supposed to be opposites of one another they're the contrapositives in a certain sense. Where that's probably not exactly 100%.
That's not the right word.
Not the right word. Yeah, that's a list of words I need to learn to use right. But but for heaven, people talk about it like, oh yeah, it lasts forever and it's amazing. It's like, okay.
And hell lasts forever and it's awful.
It's awful, right? But whenever I start getting into the nitpicky about, okay, so forever though, human beings can't even conceive of
you can't
forever.
Really think about forever, no.
And I would ask any human alive today, if I could make it so that you lived forever, would you wanna, you know?
And then you really start thinking about the consequences of this.
Right.
Or, implications.
And even better is saying, oh, what's your favorite thing to do? Name the thing. Okay, you're doing that forever now.
Forever.
But it's your favorite thing. It's supposed to be the thing that you wanted. Right? But all of a sudden it's like, oh no, you know. But when you talk about heaven, it's always, it's eternally wonderful because I either hear, but it just doesn't, you know, eternity, what does that even mean? Like each day is anew because you're given a new sense of renewal for the day. And then I'm like, okay, but that still isn't the same. Like, what kind of punishment in hell is, oh, you wake up each morning and you're punished all day, but you totally forget about it by the next day so that it's all the same amount of painful the next morning. You know what I mean? Like, it really begins to fall apart because human beings, can't really grasp the concept of eternity. And it also seems like a really cheap out because, if I can't explain eternity, that's where the thing that I say happens after you die is. And, you know, and there's always this emphasis on the life that we have, but it's always framed between the infinite beginning before you existed or before humanity. And because, you know, in Christian doctrine, Big Bang is not a thing. It's always been, you know, go to the very beginning of the Bible. God is. Period. He has always been, you know, always will be. Like, time does not apply, you know. Sorry, he's above time. So, always then. So it's like all of these things, like there's seriously infinite other, but all of it's brought down to this little bit of your time being alive, you know. But yeah. And I agree. There's no... It's extremely unfair for in any other, again, and this is another, I'm just going to say it goes back to the original thing. Take this concept, remove literally just the word God, and replace hell with punishment and heaven with reward. Like, remove the strict religious context from it, and then spit it back to anybody, and it sounds awful. You know, but it gets a pass because it's got the G word in it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing. And I know that we haven't really and aren't going to discuss double standards when it comes to religion, as far as like within the religion itself, especially within Christianity. Or else I don't think so, because, well, being honest, Christians have the ultimate out when it comes to that one, because they say, if God exists, then of course there's a double standard because he's on a different plane. So yeah, he can do whatever he wants. The creator has all of the power and all of the ownership. So yeah, he's different, you know. But when you go to that avenue, then we're all slaves. So,
right,
cool. Rightfully so, apparently. But I think any belief system that exists on tenets that if you just change the terminology around, or, you know, especially when it comes to morality, if you take God out, put a person in there. If it would be moral for a person to do it, or if it'd be immoral for a person to do it, what makes it okay for him to do it? You know, because I could say, No, actually, I can't say that. There is no excuse for it.
Well, I think the bigger thing that you're only barely missing here is that, if God has written His morality on our hearts, why can we disagree with Him?
Well, why do people disagree with Him?
Right. Well, right. Not only can we do.
That free will again.
Right.
There it is. That He gave us. That I'm now responsible for. How does that work?
Right. So, the final thing that I'd like to say is that Christianity, in fact, does not provide a moral system.
Interesting.
At all. Judaism might, but Christianity does not. Because Christianity has the concept of salvation, mercy, the Savior, right? That it doesn't matter how much wrong you have done. If only you accept Jesus as your Savior, you will spend eternity in paradise. And it doesn't matter how much good you've done for the world. If you rid the world of all diseases and suffering, if you don't believe in Jesus, you will burn forever. Is that a moral system?
No.
I don't think I could find anyone to agree.
It's like almost the Old Testament sets up the ultimate moral conundrum of, well, there's no winning. And then the New Testament is, well, actually, there's no losing. Because if you truly believe what was said, because Christians look at Jesus and call Him the Savior because He was a sacrifice to replace all of our wrongdoings, right? And there's several different, how many angels can fit on a pinhead about that one, about what does that mean, that I'm not willing to go into right now because I'm not a theologian. But seriously, okay, so it can all just go away like that, that doesn't exist anywhere else, And it all ties back to the point where, it's His to take away, It's His fault. Now, literally.
Mm-hmm.
You can literally say, why did you do that wrong thing? The moment you accept Christ, that was actually Jesus' fault. And that falls perfectly in line with doctrine. Now, that makes some people really uncomfortable to hear.
Right. Well, the very concept of a scapegoat is very, very screwed up. That you did something, but we're just going to blame it on this thing and kill it.
Yeah. Which is essentially how sacrifices have worked for a long time.
Right.
But yeah, no, I that's an interesting argument.
if you wronged me, if you stole from me, or murdered my family or something like that, something terrible, killing an animal is not going to make me feel better, right? It's not, and the analogy that's always attempted to use is, okay, well, you steal $20 from me, and I'm pretty upset about it. But however I get my $20 back, I'll feel better about it, right? Whether you pay it back to me or you get somebody else to pay it back to me. That's the way it's tried to be justified. That you can pass your debts on to somebody else and they can pay it back. But there are things that you can do that only you can pay me back for. Or maybe you can't, but that's beside the point. That you can't, I'm not going to feel better. If you murder somebody close to me, I'm not going to feel better about it if we go kill somebody else.
Right. Or more directly, I cut one of your eyes out.
Right.
And this other guy walks up and says, hey, look, it's fine. Cuts his own eye out.
Right.
You're still pissed because I've got two eyes. And now you only have one, and I didn't suffer at all for it.
Correct.
It's not about, and that's, I think, an interesting topic when we talk about justice systems that I'm going to bring back up again. I need to write that down. But it's not that you have lost and that something equal has else been done to rectify the issue. It's that you have lost and I have not, to be fair. And that's why you'll see things, and that plays out all over in humanity. In fact, what I was mentioning about justice systems is, there's this element to justice systems retribution that exists that doesn't make a whole lot of sense initially. It's like, wait a minute, that's not justice. That's just we want to see other people punished. But I think targeted retribution is what it really means. Is that it's not that I want to see someone else suffer, or it's not that I want to see someone else pay. It's that I want the person who performed the injustice to pay. It can't just be somebody else. And the weird thing about this is that when you're looking at humanity and God, there's only two players. So only one can cause an injustice on the other. You know, and that's where the whole forgiveness thing comes. It's like me, or you cutting my eye out and me saying, you don't have to do anything for that. I'm okay with the injustice. I'm going to let it be. So, I would argue that's immoral. To just dismiss a disjustice is immoral. But that's a whole other thing.
Sure.
But the alternative is, oh, well, it wasn't your injustice to commit in the first place. It's actually mine. So I lost the eye, but it was my own fault. So you are still not at fault. So you have to pick one of the two. It's either it's not your fault, it is not and never has been your fault, therefore morality cannot be derived from anything else. Or it was your fault, but someone else is going to scapegoat for you, and you do not have to pay the consequences, which is also unjust. That's the way I see it. And don't be wrong. I'm sure there's many ways that can be wiggled around in that, and many ways that it could be, many different angles it could be discussed from, but that's the way I see it right now. You know, if you can even, not to perform a false equivalency or to, you know, or a false dichotomy here, these are the only two ways it can be, but in the scenario I laid out in which there are only two participants, that is the only way it can be. You know, God or no God, that's the only way it can be. That's the way I see it.
Yep, I agree. So that's really what I had to say about Christian morality. That Christians will argue that, you know, it provides a moral system, and how can we be moral without Christianity? Well, really, there's not a way to be moral with Christianity. That it really doesn't matter. As long as sometime before you die, you accept Jesus, you can do whatever you want. And so that's it's not a compelling argument by any means. So next week we'll talk about coping with the unknown.
Might be a shorter video, I think.
I think so.
But that's okay, because I don't know about you, but by next week I'm going to be enjoying Christmas. So.
Yes.
Or, you know, the holidays, depending on.
Right.
Not to slight anybody out there who might be offended by me using the word holiday. But.
Right. So, until next week, Fauxlosophers.
Fauxlosophers.